I saw a post on Facebook the other night that asked, "What made you stop drinking?" Most people typed out a sentence or two about their health or their bank accounts, but I just stared at the screen, my thumb trembling over the glass. How do you explain to a stranger that you stopped drinking because you finally stopped wanting to die? How do you explain that the bottle wasn't just a habit, but a funeral shroud I was wrapping around myself every single night? My story doesn't start with a drink. It starts with a betrayal so cold it froze the blood in my veins. I was 20 years old, wearing the uniform of the US Army, standing tall with the kind of naive, bulletproof confidence that only a young soldier can have. I thought I had conquered life before it even started. I met her, the woman who would become my wife, and we moved at the speed of a fever dream. Engaged in 6 months, married in 12. We weren't just in love, we were in a hurry to beat the distance. She lived 4 hours away from my station, and in the military, the only way to bridge that gap is a marriage license. So we signed our names on the dotted line, bought a house, and a year later I held my newborn son in my arms. For 7 years, I was the man I was supposed to be. I was a provider, a husband, a father. I thought I was building a fortress of a life, brick by brick, but I didn't realize I was building it on a fault line. In December 2022, the earth finally opened up and swallowed me whole. After nearly 7 years of marriage, she didn't just tell me she had cheated, she told me I was nothing. With a chilling, calculated finality, she told me to leave. I stood in the home I had paid for, looking at the woman I had spent my entire adult life protecting, and realized I was being evicted from my own existence. I had no job, no money, and no place to go. But the part that truly broke my soul, the part that sent me spiraling into the abyss, was when she kept my son from me. He was about to turn 5, a little boy who looked at me like I was a hero, and suddenly I was a stranger being forced out the door. I had to pack whatever would fit in my car and drive 14 to 15 hours away to my brother's house in a different state. That drive was the longest wake of my life. 15 hours of white-knuckle silence, staring at the gray asphalt of the highway, realizing that every plan I had made for the next 50 years had been incinerated in a single afternoon. By the time I crossed the state line, the man who had worn that army uniform was dead, and his place was a hollowed-out shell. And as I pulled into my brother's driveway, I wasn't looking for a bed or a conversation. I was looking for a way to stop the feeling. I was looking for the first bottle. The descent into the bottle wasn't a slow slide, it was a free fall into a jagged abyss. I didn't know then that within a few months I'd be standing in a kitchen with a woman who would make me pour every drop of poison down the drain. But in the winter of 2023, I was a man who had decided that death was the only retirement plan that made sense. I was 27, living out of a guest room at my brother's house, and the shame of my existence was a weight I couldn't lift. So I decided to go numb. I became a ghost that smelled of stale hops and cheap grain alcohol. My routine was a terrifying clockwork of self-destruction. Before I even put on my boots for work, I was 3 or 4 beers deep. I needed that baseline of intoxication just to look at my own reflection without wanting to shatter the mirror. I managed to land a job, but it was just a way to fund my slow-motion suicide. I kept a bottle of the cheapest, harshest liquor I could find stashed in the driver's side floorboard of my car, my lunch bottle. While other people were eating sandwiches and talking about their weekends, I was sitting in the dark interior of my car, taking long, burning pulls until the world stopped spinning and started to blur. By the time the sun began to set, the real madness took over. I would pick up a 12-pack of beer on the way home, chugging half of them while driving 15 hours away from the man I used to be. I was a ticking bomb behind the wheel, a drunk driver who didn't care if he hit a tree or a telephone pole. I spent $80 to $90 every single night at the bar, chasing a blackout that never seemed to come fast enough. It got so bad that I'd find myself waking up in fast food drive-thrus, with my foot slipping off the brake and the engine roaring, people honking behind me while I blinked through a haze of confusion and self-loathing. I was a nasty-smelling drunk slob, a man who had lost his wife, his house, and was currently losing the right to see his own son. The world finally tried to pull the plug when I was fired for failing a drug and alcohol screen. I was jobless, hopeless, and ready to give up. What I didn't realize, what I couldn't have possibly known as I sat in that dark room contemplating the end, was that in just a few weeks, a 30-year-old woman would walk into my life and within 7 days offer me a key to her home and a reason to stay sober for the rest of my life. But before that salvation, I had to hit a rock bottom so hard it nearly broke my neck. In the wreckage of my life, May 2023 felt like the first breath of air after being held underwater for half a year. I was a man who had been discarded by a 7-year marriage, a father who could only see his son through the bars of a legal battle, and a drunk who had finally run out of excuses. I was certain that my story was over, that the final chapters would just be a series of lonely nights and empty bottles. But the universe has a strange way of timing its miracles. It was in that month that I met her, a 30-year-old woman who didn't look at me and see a nasty-smelling drunk slob. She looked at me and saw a man worth saving. The chemistry wasn't just a spark, it was a wildfire. We clicked instantly, a rare and terrifying recognition of souls that defies every rule of modern dating. I told her everything. The army years, the betrayal, the 15-hour drive of shame, and the bottle that had become my only friend. Most people would have turned and run at the sight of my baggage, but she didn't flinch. In an act of radical trust that still leaves me breathless, she invited me to move in with her after knowing me for only a single week. To anyone on the outside, it was insanity. To me, it was a life raft thrown to a drowning man. I took it, but I brought my demons into her house with me. For the first 2 months, I was still the man who needed a drink to survive the day, unaware that I was standing on the edge of the most important decision I would ever make. Then came the night of the switch. It wasn't a slow realization or a gradual tapering off. It was as if a light was turned on in a room that had been pitch black for years. I looked at her, this beautiful, heaven-sent angel who had opened her doors and her heart to a stranger, and I saw the life I could have if I just stopped trying to kill myself. I realized that if I kept drinking, I would eventually lose her too, and that was a price I was no longer willing to pay. That night, something in my brain simply flipped. I decided right then and there that I would never touch another drop. I didn't just want to be sober, I wanted to be the best version of myself for her. The transition was a war. Going from drinking profusely every day and night to cold turkey sobriety is a physical and mental gauntlet, but she was my medic on the front lines. She lifted me out of that deep, dark depression, not with lectures, but with unconditional sweetness. She replaced my suicidal mindset with a vision of a future where I wasn't defined by my ex-wife's betrayal or my own failures. I've been completely sober for 6 months now, and the person I was in December 2022 feels like a character in a movie I watched a long time ago. Little did I know, this sobriety was just the foundation for a proposal that would change everything. The honeymoon phase for most couples eventually fades, but for us, the fire only grew more intense as the months rolled by. By the time we hit our 8th month mark, I realized I had experienced more genuine life, more laughter, and more healing in those few 100 days than I had in the entire 7 years of my previous marriage. It was a staggering realization that time is a poor measurement of depth. I had spent nearly a decade with someone who eventually threw me away like trash, yet here was a woman who had seen me at my absolute worst, a jobless, broken addict, and had chosen to build a cathedral out of my ruins. Living together was a revelation. Every morning I woke up sober, the world looked sharper, the colors more vivid. The nasty-smelling drunk slob was gone, replaced by a man who took pride in his home and his partner. We worked in a harmony that felt supernatural, as if we had been practicing how to be a couple in 1,000 previous lifetimes. She didn't just love me, she cherished me, and for a man who had been convinced he was unlovable, that was the ultimate medicine. I began to understand that every agonizing mile of that 15-hour drive from my old life was leading me directly to her doorstep. The depression that once felt like a terminal illness began to recede, replaced by a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since I first put on my army uniform. I began to believe in the impossible. I had heard people say that you can have more feelings for someone you've known for months than someone you've known for years, and I was the living proof. She wasn't just my girlfriend, she was my soulmate, the mirror to my soul that I didn't know was missing. I looked at the wreckage of my past, the cheating, the lost job, the missing years with my son, and I realized that if none of those horrors had happened, I never would have been in the position to meet her. My life had to be completely demolished so that something beautiful could be built in its place. But the real test, the moment that would define the rest of our lives, was approaching. It was June, a year after we had first started our life together. I had stayed sober, I had worked on my mental health, and I had become the man she deserved. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. I knew that I couldn't imagine a single second of my future without this woman by my side. I had a ring, I had a plan, and I had a heart that was finally whole again. I was about to ask her to commit to me forever, unaware that the answer she would give me would lead to a wedding date that felt like a victory lap over my own dark history. June arrived like a benediction, marking 1 full year since I walked into her house as a broken man and walked out of the shadow of the bottle. Standing there, 12 months removed from the person who used to pass out and drive-thrus, I realized I didn't just love this woman, I owed her the life she had helped me reclaim. I didn't want to just be together anymore. I wanted to promise her the end of time. When I asked her to marry me, it wasn't just an engagement, it was a pact. It was me telling her that the switch I flipped back in May 2023 was locked in place forever. She said yes, and in that moment, the last lingering ghost of my 7-year marriage finally vanished. We're aiming to get married next fall, and the irony isn't lost on me. I spent my early 20s rushing into a marriage for the sake of army logistics and proximity, building a life that eventually collapsed into dust. But this time it's different. This isn't about convenience or desperation. It's about a man who was genuinely and unconditionally given his entire self back by a woman who saw his worth when he was worthless. She is the only person I've ever been with that I have truly, deeply loved without armor or reservation. Looking at our upcoming wedding date feels like looking at a finish line, but also a starting block for a life that I actually want to be awake for. I often think back to that drive, the 15 hours of hell that brought me here. I think about my son, who is turning 6 in just a few days, and I know that the best gift I can ever give him is a father who is sober, present, and happy. I realize now that every trauma I endured was just a brutal redirection. If my ex-wife hadn't cheated, if she hadn't kicked me out, if I hadn't lost everything and descended into that bottle, I never would have moved those 14 hours away. I never would have been in the right place at the right time to meet this heaven-sent angel. The universe had to break me to make me fit for her. So when I see that question on Facebook, what made you stop drinking? I don't think about the hangovers or the money. I think about her face. I think about the fact that I haven't touched a drop in over half a year because the high of being loved by her is better than any chemical numbness I could buy at a bar. I honestly wouldn't know where I'd be or how life would be if I had never met her. I'd likely be a statistic, another veteran lost to the bottle and the dark. Instead, I am a fiancé, a father, and a man who is finally home. I damn sure hope I never have to find out what life is like without her, because for the first time in 27 years, the light is finally staying on.